Okay, let's unpack this. You've handed us some really compelling source material here, specifically looking at excerpts from Chapter 1 of the RBT Ethics Code.
Mm.
It's not just, a list of rules. It's more like a deep dive into the history that shaped the registered behavior technician credential and, critically, its ethics code.
That's right.
Our mission today, really, is to journey through that history and truly understand why ethical standards aren't just a requirement, but like the absolute bedrock for the RBT role today, exploring how the profound challenges of the past forged the standards we now rely on.
And what's particularly fascinating about this material, I think, is how it shows the direct line between historical events, even, painful ones, and the ethical framework that governs practice today. This isn't abstract history. It's foundational to understanding the ethical responsibilities inherent in being an RBT.
Exactly. The registered behavior technician, the RBT, it's defined in this material as a paraprofessional, right? An entry-level behavioral technician.
Correct. Entry-level.
Their place in the field is very specific. They practice under the close, ongoing supervision of a certified professional like a BCBA or BCBAD.
And their role is absolutely crucial. RBTs are typically the individual spending the most time providing direct services, working face-to-face with clients.
Right.
They're implementing the behavior change procedures, collecting data, interacting daily with individuals, often those diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, developmental delays, or mental health issues.
Right. And the source material makes an immediate, really powerful point right at the start. It sort of frames the development of credentials like the RBT and the standards that go with them as a significant evolution from earlier times in the field. Those earlier times, it states, were scarred by the abuse and mistreatment of clients. That's a heavy starting point.
It is. It really is. And it tells us immediately that the RBT credential didn't just appear out of, say, administrative convenience.
Yeah.
It emerged from a necessity, a real need for greater accountability and client protection. The credential itself, which the source says was announced by the BACB in 2014 and got NCCA accreditation in 2016.
Okay.
It's part of this larger historical trajectory, really driven by the need to professionalize and safeguard vulnerable individuals receiving behavior analytic services.
Here's where the history truly grounds everything, I think. The material points to a pivotal event, the Sunland Training Center in Miami scandal, back in 1972.
Sunland, yeah.
This wasn't a small incident. This residential facility housed several hundred disabled clients, and it became, as the source puts it, ground zero for a major abuse investigation in Florida.
The catalyst for this investigation was incredibly serious. It was triggered in April 1971 after a parent reported abuse.
A parent report.
Yes. And this led to an intensive investigation into resident abuse by the Florida Division of Mental Retardation and the Dade County Attorney's Office. Think about that state and local legal authorities getting involved because of reported abuse in a residential facility using behavioral approaches.
And it's vital, isn't it, to understand the context of the early 1970s. The material highlights two critical factors that kind of contributed to the environment where something like Sunland could happen.
Definitely.
First, the field of applied behavior analysis was incredibly young. There was very little applied research available. The Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, JABA, which is now, a cornerstone publication.
A major journal, yeah.
It only started publishing a few years prior, in 1968.
So practitioners were working with powerful principles, but without the extensive peer-reviewed evidence base we have today to guide their application.
Right.
They were, in some ways, operating in kind of uncharted territory when it came to widespread clinical application.
And the second, perhaps even more critical point the source emphasizes about this period is, well, it's chilling. Oh, there was no code of ethics for behavioral researchers or practitioners.
None. Zero. Imagine having access to techniques that could profoundly influence behavior without a formalized, agreed-upon set of ethical standards to guide how and when to apply them. Without clear rules about client welfare, consent, boundaries, or appropriate procedures. This lack of both empirical guidance and ethical structure created a dangerous vacuum.
That vacuum, combined with the inherent vulnerability of individuals in residential institutions like Sunland, it just created a perfect storm.
It seems so.
The Sunland scandal wasn't just about individual acts of cruelty. It exposed systemic issues within the application of behavioral methods at that time, didn't it? Issues amplified by that lack of established research and ethical oversight.
Exactly. The source implies that even if intentions were sometimes good, the absence of structure and guidance meant that harmful practices could develop and just persist unchecked. The investigation into Sunland wasn't just about identifying abuse. It was about understanding how it happened and, critically, how to prevent it from ever happening again, particularly within the context of behavioral interventions.
So what was the response? What happened after this crisis hit?
Well, the director of the State Health and Rehabilitative Services Division of Retardation took immediate action. They formed a 9-member blue ribbon panel.
Okay, a blue ribbon panel.
Yeah. Initially, their mandate was focused on treatment and protecting residential clients within the existing structures.
That makes sense.
But the material highlights a crucial expansion of their role. This panel took on the responsibility of making recommendations to prevent future systematic abuses.
Systematic abuses, that's key.
Yes. And the key phrase the source uses is abuses conducted in the name of behavior modification. This shows that the scrutiny was specifically on the application of behavioral techniques within these vulnerable settings.
They recognized that simply stopping individual abusers wasn't enough. They needed to address the conditions, the system, that allowed such things to occur under the guise of treatment.
Precisely.
And the panel's recommendations, as outlined in the source, were pretty foundational. What were the key ones?
2 main powerful recommendations emerged. First, strong support for a statewide advocacy program.
Advocacy.
This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a call for robust, independent oversight. Staff members from this program would be allowed, crucially, unannounced visits to institutions.
Unannounced.
Yes. And their role was to collect information from everyone: personnel, residents themselves, parents, facility staff, and concerned citizens. Anyone with information.
Why was that? Why the unannounced visits and talking to everyone? Why was that so important?
Well, because institutions, especially residential ones, can become closed systems, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
Lack of transparency allows problems to fester. An independent advocacy program with the power of unannounced visits and collecting information from all stakeholders, including the clients themselves and their families, it created an essential external layer of oversight.
Oh, okay.
It broke down potential secrecy and gave a voice to those who might otherwise be unable to report issues. It was a direct countermeasure to the isolation and lack of visibility that contributed to the abuse.
That makes perfect sense. And the second key recommendation, it addressed the practice itself. Professional peer review.
Yes, peer review. The panel recommended that all behavior programs implemented in these settings should undergo peer review.
Okay.
The source explains the rationale. This review was intended to ensure that treatment was derived from the literature directly addressing that identified lack of empirical grounding at the time.
Right, that lack of research base.
Exactly. And, equally important, that no procedures considered experimental were used on clients.
So they were essentially saying, look, you need to base your practice on what's known and supported, and you absolutely cannot use vulnerable individuals as subjects for unproven methods.
Precisely. Peer review by qualified professionals provided a quality control mechanism. It ensured that the behavioral interventions being used were consistent with the best available knowledge at the time and screened out practices that were potentially harmful or simply not supported by evidence. These 2 recommendations, independent advocacy and professional peer review, were direct responses to the conditions that enabled the Sunland abuses. Lack of external oversight and practice not sufficiently grounded in evidence or ethical consideration.
The source then describes the subsequent actions taken, sort of building on these recommendations, showing how the field and the state moved forward. The Florida Association for Retarded Children, which is now ARC of Florida, played a pretty significant role here.
They did. They became strong advocates for humane treatment, absolutely. But they also specifically endorsed data-based behavioral treatment, provided it was under strict guidelines and close supervision by properly trained professionals.
That pairing is key.
It is. They weren't saying no behavior modification. They were saying behavior modification done correctly, ethically, and with oversight. That's the crucial difference.
And the state government followed through.
It seems so. The Florida Division of Retardation instituted systemic reforms based on the panel's work, including setting up both statewide and local peer review committees specifically dedicated to behavior modification programming across their facilities.
So they formalized that peer review idea.
They did. established a formal structure for implementing it. And one of these committees, the Florida Statewide Peer Review Committee for Behavior Modification, or PRC, went even further. They established a concrete set of guidelines for using behavioral procedures.
Guidelines.
And the significance here, as highlighted in the source, is that these guidelines weren't just internal to Florida. They were subsequently adopted by the National Association for Retarded Citizens and formally by the Florida Division of Retardation itself.
Wow, that's a huge step. State-level guidelines getting national traction. That suggests they were seen as really robust and necessary standards for the ethical application of behavioral techniques.
Absolutely. It points to the perceived quality and necessity of those guidelines. And this state-funded PRC was very active for several years. They didn't just write guidelines and, walk away.
Right.
They visited institutions, they educated staff on these new standards, and they made recommendations aimed at ensuring more ethical treatment practices were being followed on the ground. It was a period of active reform and education, really driven by the lessons of the past.
And this active work then led to another major development outlined in the source, the move towards formal professional credentialing.
Yes. The PRC, working in conjunction with the Florida Association for Behavior Analysis, FEBA, which the source notes was founded in 1980.
Okay, FEBA.
They began a process of certifying behavior analysts. This was done through a testing program sponsored by the Division of Retardation.
So testing and certification started way back then in Florida.
It was a pivotal step towards professionalizing the field there. Certification through testing meant there was now a mechanism to verify that practitioners had a baseline level of knowledge and competence in applying behavioral principles safely and effectively.
It adds another layer of client protection.
Exactly. Ensuring practitioners met certain standards.
And the formal commitment to ethics continued to deepen. A key milestone mentioned is that in 1988, the FEBA membership adopted the FEBA Code of Ethics.
And the source points out, importantly, that FEBA was the first state association to do so.
First one.
Yeah. This wasn't a mandate from the state. This was the professional community itself taking ownership and formalizing its ethical responsibilities. Adopting their own code was a powerful statement about their commitment to upholding high standards of conduct for their members.
So you have this whole sequence. The crisis at Sunland, exposing the dangers of practice without structure.
All right.
The Blue Ribbon Panel identifying key systemic solutions like advocacy and peer review. Yep. The state implementing reforms and guidelines. The field developing a certification process. And finally, the professional association establishing a formal code of ethics.
It's a clear progression, isn't it? Each step seems like a direct consequence of the recognition that powerful technology requires robust safeguards. The lack of research and lack of ethics exposed at Sunland led directly to calls for evidence-based practice and formal ethical standards.
Which in
turn drove the development of guidelines, certification, and professional codes. It all connects.
This raises an important question then. How does this whole historical journey, these specific events and responses in Florida, directly connect to the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, the BACB, and the RBT Ethics Code that, RBTs use today?
Well, the source makes that connection explicitly. It brings it right back to the most fundamental ethical principle in the helping professions: do no harm.
Primum non nocere.
Exactly. The harsh lesson from the Florida case, stated clearly in the material, was that great harm could be done, even by people who perhaps didn't set out with malicious intent. The environment, the lack of structure, allowed it to happen.
And the source notes that abuse was prevented not just by stopping individuals, but specifically when appropriate comprehensive strategies were adopted.
Right, and those comprehensive strategies are precisely the things we've just discussed. External oversight through advocacy, internal quality control through peer review and grounding practice in literature, competence verification through certification, and a clear guide for conduct through a code of ethics.
Oh, those layers.
Yes, those layers of protection developed over years in response to crisis are the foundation upon which current ethical practice stands.
And the source explicitly states the purpose of the volume containing these excerpts, the RBT Ethics Code itself. It says, it exists to try to elucidate the current Behavior Analyst Certification Board RBT Ethics Code to assist registered behavior technicians in making the right choices on a daily basis.
That's the direct link right there. The BACB RBT Ethics Code is not just some list of rules handed down from on high. It's a distillation of these hard-won historical lessons. It's designed, based on this history, to provide a framework that helps RBTs who are on the front lines providing direct care navigate the complexities of their role ethically and safely every single day. It's about preventing harm by guiding conduct and ensuring practice is responsible and accountable.
So what does all this mean for you listening now, maybe someone working in or learning about the RBT role? It means the ethical guidelines you adhere to. They aren't arbitrary bureaucratic requirements, not at all.
No.
They're a direct consequence of a history that showed quite starkly what happens when ethical considerations and robust oversight are insufficient. Your code is a protective framework built from the ground up in response to real-world problems, specifically designed to safeguard the vulnerable individuals you work with. It represents the field's deep commitment, really forged in crisis, to ethical conduct, evidence-based practice, supervision, and accountability.
Understanding this history, I think, transforms the ethics code from maybe a compliance checklist into what it should be, a living document, a tool for proactive ethical decision-making, informed by the serious consequences of past failures.
Absolutely. And to leave you with a thought for further consideration, drawing directly from the source material. We've seen how comprehensive strategies were needed to prevent past abuse, and how the RBT Ethics Code is explicitly there to help RBTs make the right choices daily. Given this history, and the fact that harm could occur even with potentially good intentions in the past, how does understanding this background shift your perspective on your personal responsibility for ongoing ethical reflection and proactive decision-making in your everyday practice?
That's a great question to ponder.
How does knowing why these rules exist empower you specifically to be a vigilant and effective safeguard for the individuals you serve, going beyond just, following procedures? Something to think about.